My name is Daniel Ibarrondo, and I didn't know my filter was going to show up, but as you can see, I've racked up quite a few degrees in my lifetime, and there's a reason for that. Only in competition with myself, uh, and why in competition with myself? Because I was born and raised in Harlem, and I lived smack on the middle of Harlem on 125th Street. Uh, Home was the public housing projects, a single mother raising five children, doing as best as she can. And the time period was a time of plenty of gangs, plenty of drugs, plenty of prostitution. But at the same time, there was also plenty of love because we celebrated graduations, weddings, birthdays, uh, and achievements. And I am of Puerto Rican descent. My parents moved to New York City from Puerto Rico in the 1940s or 50s during that first large migration of Puerto Ricans to the US. And they settled in East Harlem first and then on the West Harlem. East Harlem was primarily known as El Barrio, um, which also gave birth to a famous movie called West Side Story about the gangs, fights between Puerto Ricans and Italians in the neighborhood. So we moved over to West Harlem. And West Harlem provided me with the beginning of what is today's topic, teaching inclusivity skills. And it's interesting for many of us how the life skills that we currently teach today, the work that we currently do today to advance humanity, for many of us has some deep rooted sense in our life experiences and our upbringing. And for me, it was being brought up in Harlem, in West Harlem, uh, rather the Black Harlem versus the Latino East Harlem, being brought up without having any sense of inclusiveness, if you will, coupled without coupled with a lack of sense of identity. Uh, Being brought up Puerto Rican and being brought up as a dark-skinned Puerto Rican, many of my friends in Harlem were African American, and trying to be inclusive, trying to fit in because we're all hardwired to belong to a community. I would tell them, I'm Black just like you, right? Uh, and there was, I would tell them that because I can sense how they would look at me and say, you look dark skinned, but you're not exactly African American. I don't know what you are. And I would say, I'm Black, just like you. And they would say, no, you're not. And obvious question response to that is why? And they're like, well, first of all, you speak Spanish. Um, so African Americans don't speak Spanish. You eat rice and beans. African Americans, that's not our daily staple. Um, and you eat some other stuff that we don't eat. And your parents are not from this country. So therefore, you're not Black. I'm like, okay, fine. And so I wrestled with that um, with regards to my relationship with the African American community in Harlem. But then also, with the Puerto Rican community, uh, I had no sense of belonging other than my parents are Puerto Rican, all of my cousins and aunts and uncles and grandparents were Puerto Rican. But we eat rice and beans, yes, and we speak Spanish. But there's got to be much more than that in order to belong to this group, this community of Puerto Ricans. At least I felt, and I did not receive that. Particularly, my mother only had a second grade education, as did my father. So they knew very little, if anything, about Puerto Rican history, uh, social science, culture, other than that they were Puerto Rican. And the same thing happened with many of my family members. The basic uh, thread that united us all was that they all arrived in New York City from Puerto Rico. Uh, we ate rice and beans and we spoke Spanish. Um, but other than that, um, I was fascinated how African Americans had a culture. They had African American heroes. They had African American politicians, government officials, corporate people, and we I didn't know whether Puerto Ricans had anything uh, of that nature that would make me feel part of this community. And so by the time I reached entrance into high school, I told my parents I wanted to go to high school in Puerto Rico. And my mom immediately freaked out. She said, "Well, you hardly speak Spanish. You don't know anything about Puerto Rico. And how are you going to fit in?" And I said, "That's exactly why I want to go to high school in Puerto Rico, because I hardly speak Spanish and I don't know anything about Puerto Rico, history, anything. And yet I am a Puerto Rican." And so she acquiesced. Thank you, Mom, for letting a 15-year-old venture to go live with his uncle in Puerto Rico. And I was fortunate enough that I attended a public school, which was a co-ed boarding school run by the by the Puerto Rico Department of Education. And within that time period, which was only 1 year, I was able to do 2 years in one. I took a lot of courses. I learned a lot, and graduated from high school by the age of 16. But the more fascinating part, besides the high school accomplishment and graduating and managing learning Spanish while attending instruction all in Spanish, I was empowered. Okay, I was empowered because I learned that there were Puerto Rican doctors, there were Puerto Rican engineers, lawyers, uh, nurses, there were Puerto Rican entities, corporations. Puerto Ricans were running large pharmaceutical companies that were headquartered in the US. There were Puerto Rican artists whose art was exhibited in the most fascinating places, such as the Louvre in France. And I was just enthralled with all of this Puerto Ricanness, if you will. And so that gave me a sense of identity, a sense of belonging, a sense of community, and more importantly, a sense of empowerment as we talk about inclusivity. And when it came to race, I was even more fascinated because I learned that the Puerto Rican is made up of Africans, Europeans, and the Taino Indians, who were the first inhabitants of Puerto Rico. So the first inhabitants were the Taino Indians, and then Spain came and colonized the island. They enslaved some of the Indians, some escaped to Venezuela, some intermarried with Spaniards. From that intermarriage with Spaniards, okay, once the Indian population was wiped out by Spain, they imported, they brought over African slaves, right? And the African slaves were allowed to marry with the offspring of the Spanish and Indian. And so that beautiful mixed salad gave birth to what we know today as a Puerto Rican, which is a mixture of those three races. And so that furthered my empowerment. And so I kind of felt then that my mission had been accomplished, okay, um, in terms of learning about what community I belong to, okay, what identity I have, and this dichotomy about what is my race. And so, with being empowered with that, I returned to the US and amassed a lot of education because I kept questioning, I kept wanting to know more. And in that process, as I moved up, started working for higher education, I first practiced law. And after practicing law in New York City, I slowly gravitated towards teaching law. And then that slowly gravitated me to get into the realm of education and educational technologies and bicultural, bilingual education. And so uh, the quest for knowledge, the thirst, led me to amass a degree in education, specialist degree from Seton Hall University in bilingual bicultural education, besides the law degree and my doctorate at Pepperdine University. But it all comes together with right now, as an associate dean at Cambridge College, one of the best parts of my current employment duties, job duties, and I don't call it a job, it's more of a passion, is Cambridge College is currently embarking on a racial equity and social justice initiative. We are looking at all parts of the college, whether it's the academics, whether it's the courses, whether it's the service providers, who do we buy paper from, whether it's the community, whether it's the board of governors, the administration, the staff. We're turning the college upside down to find where racial equity and social justice can be implemented within the college. And one of the initiatives, one of the tasks that I'm working with is the Community Engagement Committee. And in that task, we're looking at the community and to see whether the community we partner with, the community we engage with, has the same mission, values, goals, as does Cambridge College in regard to racial equity and social justice. And so, what I bring to that committee is my personal experience with inclusiveness, as well as how did I become better at inclusiveness. And I'd like to talk about this for a moment, not from a uh, mental health matter. I'm not going to talk about cognitive behaviors and things of that matter that are also important. But I like to talk about it from my personal experience, my this human experience rather. And so one of the things that I learned along the way, once I was empowered to understand who I am and what community I belong to, um, that eventually changed to I found it constricting to say I'm a Puerto Rican. I found it constricting to say I'm an African American. Um, I found it better to say I'm a human being because that's what we all are. Um, but my thinking, my purview in allowing myself to see myself as a human being only occurs because I started to, and this is part of my development in higher education administration, is that I started to wonder, to think, okay, all right, we're developing a policy for students um, in relation to whatever, access to clubs, student clubs at the college. And so I started to think, okay, this policy, how does this policy look for a woman? How does this policy look for an African American? How does this policy look for a Latino? How does this policy look for an Asian? How does this policy look not for a wide LGBTQ plus committee, but individually, an L, a G, a B, okay? How, and through that, I was able to train myself to take a step back whenever we develop policies that affect people's lives. I was able to take a step back to see, to attempt to see rather, how it would look, how would this policy affect any of those persons, whether they're at the table or not. Okay, and I think that um, developing that sense, okay, is very important, and it's very important today, particularly here in the U.S., but it's happening global too, as we begin to re-examine um, past practices, past governmental policies, uh, uh, history books, okay, uh, looking to see whether they're representative, whether they are accurate, whether they show the entire story, okay? And that's particularly important for us in the United States because, in essence, the United States is a concept. Um, some consider it a melting pot, some don't. But it's a concept in my purview, because if I'm from Cambodia, for example, I can come to the United States and I can live as a Cambodian within my Cambodian culture, my Cambodian community, and I can watch cable TV and all the shows from back home in Cambodia, or streaming on the internet, right? So my interaction with other ethnic Americans may be limited. Same thing with the Puerto Rican, uh, with the African American, with the Caucasian, okay? Um, but we are changing. We are changing, okay? With the uh, George Floyd situation, with the, uh, well, there's so many situations going on right now um, that all point to the need to be inclusive. And so one of those aspects that I teach is, now that we are at the table, let's assume that within your entity, your corporation, your community organization, your government, wherever you work, wherever you lead a one or two or three people in a group, um, now that they are at the table, and by they I mean LGBTQ plus, African Americans, Asians, everybody and anybody that you need to include at the table. Now that they're at the table, what do we do? Okay, so here's what we do. We listen. We listen. If you look at like a Venn diagram, right? That middle section, it's nothing but chaos. And that area of chaos requires that we create new paradigms to solve solutions, to have solutions for problems that have not occurred yet, and to solve problems that we haven't been able to solve in 20 plus years. But we listen. Listening is such an important act. And I'll tell you why. Because if I was at your table and you heard my story, which I just briefly mentioned about a Puerto Rican growing up in West Harlem and searching for inclusiveness and identity, if you heard that story and I'm an employee in your entity, now that you heard it, what do you do? Okay. Um, The old way of doing something would be, oh, okay, well, let's look at our HR data charts, and let's look at how many Puerto Ricans are in this department, that department, this department, and let's set up a benchmark and proceed to hire whatever it is. Let's move the dial, 2%, 3%, 7%. Well, that's the old way of doing things, because you heard my story, but you did not act upon my story. So the task for us, as leaders, as members of any entity, of any group, is, now that I've heard the story, how do I go about to per- turn it into action? And that action turns into a policy. How do I incorporate Daniel's story of desiring, or of not being included in this community for whatever reasons? But how do I bring his story to life? How do I bring his story as part of the policy, the new policy that we're going to create? What does that look like? I'm not going to go into what that process will be, because for each entity is going to be a different process. It's going to be a learning process. It's going to be a listening process. But I do know that when you are inclusive, there are a few things that are going to occur for you and for your entity. There's going to be a sense of belonging, okay, for all of the folks that you work with. There's going to be a voice, okay, whether it's from an ethnic American or a gender representative, okay. There's going to be empowerment. There's going to be a sense of community, and there's going to be a group identity that will just grow organically into other areas, other services, other resources that your entity would not have imagined. Okay. I know this for a fact because I'm already seeing this. I'm already seeing this not only with Cambridge College, but I'm also already seeing this with other entities that I advise in matters of diversity, equity, and inclusiveness. And so I'm happy to share that with you beyond uh, this event for World Unity Week. And you can find me on Facebook, okay, and on LinkedIn as well. Thank you. Thank you. It's been an honor, from my humble beginnings, to certainly be here and address you today together, to be together as we advance humanity. Thank you so much.